This presentation is in loving memory of Chaim Shmuel Kornstein, Samuel Kornstein, Zichrono Livracha. I didn't know very much about him. I had never met him, of course. He died before I was born. I know from my mother that he had been arrested in Paris, where he lived in 1942, sent to Auschwitz. Letters between my mother and my grandfather in Yiddish simply stopped in 1942, and that's what I knew. So this presentation, I hope, will bring him a little bit more alive for me and for you. Of course, Samuel Kornstein was my grandfather. For some of you in this picture, he's your great-grandfather, and for others in this picture, he was your great-great-grandfather. I don't know very much about him. I do have some pictures, which I'll share with you in this presentation. I do know that he was handsome, I can tell from the pictures. My mother used to say that a lot, and that he also played the fiddle. So for those of you who are musical, well, you see where it comes from. Making this presentation on Holocaust Day in 2021 helped me to learn a lot more about him, and I just hope that you'll learn some more also and keep his memory alive. He is one of the 6 million. From doing research recently, I found out that my grandfather was born in Bilgrey, or Bilgoraj, Poland, May 6, 1883. It was not a shtetl, it was not a little village, it was actually a big town, and in Poland, and definitely surrounded by fields and forests. You'll see soon. Bilgrey, by the way, in Yiddish it's called Bilgore, but I'll call it Bilgrey, is about 85 kilometers south of Lublin. When my grandfather was born, there were about 5,000 people there, almost half of whom were Jewish. The claim to fame of Bilgrey is that the Yiddish writers Isaac Bashevis Singer and his brother, who were actually born there. So that makes it famous even more. In about 2016, a retired businessman, I'll pronounce his name probably incorrectly, Tadeusz Kuzminski, decided to rebuild a wooden town, and in the very middle of the market is a synagogue, and the synagogue is an exact replica of the Wolpa Shul. He rebuilt it from photographs in the 1920s. The Nazis destroyed, of course, all of the buildings, including all of the shuls. It was considered the most beautiful shul in Eastern Europe before the Nazis came in World War II. There are no Jews living there today. The Jews were killed or left to Russia during World War II if they were able to escape, and the rest were murdered. My grandfather left Poland in the early 1900s. I know that he came to America in his mid to late 20s. In New York, he met and he married my grandmother, Ida Lapidus. Her name was also Alta. She was from Kovne, or Konis, it's called, Lithuania. I know that they spoke Yiddish to each other, not English, not Polish. When my mother was a little girl, up to the age of 5, she only spoke in Yiddish. She didn't even know English. And not till my mother went to first grade did she start to learn English. This is a picture of their wedding. I think it is around 1910 because my mother was born in 1913. After my mother, Lena Leah Kornstein, was born, in 1915 came her brother Morris, in 1917 came Uncle Max. This is a picture of Uncle Max in 1922 when he was 5 years old. This is my grandfather's handwriting. Unfortunately, Ida Lapidus and Samuel Kornstein, my grandparents, got a divorce. It was highly unusual in those days, but they did. They got a divorce. And in 1922, Samuel, my grandfather, decided to go back to Europe to leave America. I'm not quite sure the reasons. There could be several. But he decided to take with him his little son, Max, who was 5. This is actually his passport picture. It was considered kidnapping. They went to Belgium because my grandfather had several half-brothers in Belgium, and that did not work out very well. Sorry. So they ended up going to Paris. He actually asked Max, I understand, if he wanted to go to Europe, and perhaps he would never see his mother, sister, or brother again, and Max, being a little child, agreed, okay, a little understanding the repercussions. And Max and Samuel stayed in Paris until much later, before the World War, and you'll hear more about that soon. In Paris, my grandfather had a very small shop where he designed and made specialized jewelry boxes at 30 Rue de Vaucouleurs in Arrondissement 11, which is neighborhood number 11 in Paris. I know that Uncle Max went door to door selling some of these jewelry boxes. This is a photograph of the street where my grandfather had his workshop. It's a photograph from the 1930s. In 1995, my daughter Adi went into the Israeli army, and about a month before, she did an army trip with me. We went to Paris and to England. And in Paris, we went to my grandfather's workshop. We tried to find it, number 30 Rue de Vaucouleurs. And we saw something similar to this, of course, much more modern, with cars and beautiful facades. So we didn't find the exact workshop, but we imagined it. I remember seeing an old building with stairs going up. Perhaps the workshop was there. Perhaps it was in a basement area. We don't know. Across the street on the left, we did see a lot of sweatshops in 1995 of many people working. It's now a North African neighborhood, a lot of Moroccans, Moroccan restaurants, etc. And that's what we found out. I know from my mother and also from my cousin Fran, who's Max's daughter, that my grandfather and Uncle Max lived in a small country house in the countryside called Livry-Gargan. I looked on Google Maps, and it's 16 kilometers from where their workshop would have been. I don't know if they lived there all the time or if they lived there part of the time, but at least some of the time they lived there. I know that Max lived there sometimes on his own as a teenager, and when Samuel was working in Paris itself. My grandfather and Uncle Max were in Paris for about 11 years. In 1933, when Max was about 16, is when Adolf Hitler became the Chancellor of Germany. They saw in Germany that there were book burnings of anyone's writings who was considered anti-German. Concentration camps began, Dachau began in 1933, for political opponents and anyone deemed dangerous. In 1934, Hitler declared himself the absolute dictator of Germany, and in 1935, the Nuremberg laws were passed, which were highly anti-Semitic and racist. They helped German citizens determine who was of a pure race, pure Aryan race. Jews were not considered having pure blood. We were considered to be a separate race at that time. And there was segregation between Germans and Jews in Germany. Over 500,000 native-born German Jews lost their citizenship in Germany overnight, and they were considered just simply subjects. So certainly my grandfather and Max were watching this on the news and of course became very concerned, even though they didn't live in Germany, but France was right next door. The Nazis had not reached Paris yet, and I remember my mother telling me many times that she went to Paris. I didn't remember the year, but it was 1935. She was 22 years old, and my Uncle Max was 18 years old. My grandfather would have been 52 at the time. I remember that she spoke French. She adored French, and they spoke in French, they spoke in Yiddish, and she had a wonderful time there. So the Nazis had not arrived yet. My mother spent time in Paris, not a long time. I believe it was a couple of good weeks. She went back to New York. 2 years later, my grandfather sent Uncle Max, who was 20 at the time, back to the safety of America to his mother and his sister in New York. Max's brother Morris, my uncle, had already died in 1933. Now, Max had an easy time getting back to New York because he was an American citizen, so he, of course, could easily leave France. On the other hand, my grandfather was a naturalized American citizen, so he was in France for many years and lost his American citizenship. In order to renew it, he needed to go to the embassy, and he also needed to come back to America, I understand, from my cousin Fran, which he was not able to do. But there were a lot of difficulties, and for a variety of reasons, he was not allowed back to the United States, and he was not even an American citizen at that time because his citizenship had expired. In May of 1940, 3 years later, the Nazis invaded France and Paris, and since my grandfather could not get back, he was stuck. The doors had shut in 1941 in order to leave France, and especially Paris. My mother kept writing letters in Yiddish to my grandfather, "Papa, come back, come back, come back." And he tried, but he was not able, so he was stuck in France. So welcoming Uncle Max back to New York in 1937 would have been my mother, Lena Kornstein. She would have been 24 at the time. Morris, his brother, had died several years previously at age 18 in 1933. This is a picture of Morris on the left in 1928 March, which was his 13th birthday and his bar mitzvah. It is the only picture that I have of my Uncle Morris. He seemed to be a lovely, sweet, kind young man, and I'm sorry that I never got to meet him. So I understood that Uncle Max came back to America in 1937 because the Nazis were in power and things were beginning to be dangerous in France. I was never told another reason, and that could possibly be, my mother's not around to ask anymore, but perhaps Uncle Max came back to attend his sister's wedding. So my parents were married in March 26, 1938, and he would have come back perhaps at the end of the year on a ship or the beginning of the year on a ship. It certainly would make sense of why they wouldn't wait till 1938 or 39 to send him back, and that he would have chosen 37 to come and to be at the wedding. I like to think that that would be true and that he was at the wedding. I was never told. I've never seen any pictures of the wedding. I wonder if that's true. This is a photo a year after they were married of my mother, Lena and Kornstein, and my father, Max Newman. So Uncle Max in 1937 went back to New York, of course. He would have gone to visit the grave of his brother Morris, who died in 1933. I had never seen this headstone, but just yesterday when Sherman and I were looking on Google for Chaim Shmuel Kornstein, if there's any more evidence of his life, immediately came up Morris Kornstein's findagrave.com headstone. So here it is, a picture. So it's his, I never knew that my uncle's name was Moshe Mendel. I only knew him as, or I only knew of him as Morris Kornstein. I knew he was 18 years old. I did not know, if you look in the Hebrew, that it's Chaim Shmuel, my grandfather, HaKohen. So my grandfather was a Kohen. I never knew that before yesterday. I see that there's a heart on the stone, and that's very rare, so he was truly loved. Gone but not forgotten, beloved son and brother is written on the gravestone. My mother told me he died Erev Pesach, but clearly on April 17th, we looked it up as Kaf Aleph Nisan. He basically died on the Chag of the 7th day of Passover. So Zichrono Livracha. I did not know that he is buried in Queens. So when we go back to America, God willing, we will try to visit his cemetery plot, grave number 3. Since I'm talking about Morris, Zichrono Livracha, and I've been going through some old suitcases and photographs, I came upon this autograph book, which I have seen over the years, but it has not been in sight for many years. This is an autograph book from June 24th, 1931, when Morris was 16 years old. He graduated from Brooklyn, New York, Montauk Junior High School. I thought it was a high school, but online it's a junior high school. It would have been 8th grade, which is almost a full education, if you compare it to our days. And I also found out that his nickname was Murray because of one of the autographs you'll see in just a moment. When I opened his autograph book this morning, I flipped through the pages, and I had never really looked at it carefully, but I read each of them, and I came across these two, which made me smile, and it sort of brought Morris alive for me. On the left is to Murray. Again, I never knew his nickname was Murray. May your luck be never failing. May your luck be ever true. Your classmate, Sam Schneck. P.S. Saved you from destruction. I wonder what he had done to save him from destruction. I had a big smile on my face from that one. And on the right, to Murray, best wishes and success. Your classmate, Joe Koch, the gambler. So these are regular, normal, junior high kids, and we brought them alive for a few minutes here. As I was flipping in Morris's autograph book, I came upon this page. May you never feel the color of this page. Signed, your cousin Phil. Phil Lapidus was Morris's first cousin. I'll show you in the next slide where he fits in. I did not know that they would have been in the same school or basically probably the same age. This is a picture of Phil Lapidus in the American Army. I don't know how old he was here. I assume early 20s. And his cousin Morris would have died at age 18, but this is Phil. So since we're talking about Phil, I had to get up and look at the picture on my wall, which I actually prepared in 1982, a few days before we made Aliyah to Israel, of my mother's family, the Lapidus family. And I have a close-up in the next slide. You'll see it a little bit easier. But basically, the Lapidus great-grandparents, my great-grandparents, had 3 children. Abraham was the first, and then Chaim, and then my grandmother, Ida, or Alta. Now, Chaim had 4 children, Meir, Lena Kaplan, some of you know her, or knew her, George, and Phil. So Phil would have been the last child of Chaim. And then Ida had 3 children, my mother, Lena, and then Morris, and then Max. So this is how you see that Morris and Phil are first cousins. In 1982, August 26th, we were in New York, and I brought this family tree that I had prepared, and I invited previously, several months previously, all of the people who were alive and interested in coming to a family gathering at George's house. George's is penthouse in New York. And about 30, 40 people showed up, cousins whom I had never met before, and it was very touching. And then I gave out copies of this family tree. They, of course, vowed to get together every year, but that was the one and only time that they all got together, and since many people have died. But it was a very, very special day, and I'm glad I had a chance to meet my cousins also. So back to 1937, when my Uncle Max came back to America, he would have come back to his mother, and of course my mother, his sister. This is a picture of his mother, Ida Lapidus Kornstein, much later in life. She passed away in 1962. She was 76 years old. I had met her basically only once for one day, so I, of course, did not really know her. And when we were looking up for this presentation in the internet, we went to findagrave.com. And sure enough, I found out that she was buried in Queens. So I did not know that we have the actual grave. So this was something that I learned also. So back to my grandfather. In September of 1942, he was rounded up, basically arrested by the French police in Paris and taken to the Drancy internment camp. It's 12 kilometers northeast of Paris. You can see on this Google map, of course. The camp was basically abandoned, unfinished apartment buildings. You'll see in the next slide. It was in operation from 1941 to 1944, 3 years, and over 67,000 Jews, Czechoslovakian Jews, French Jews, etc., were interned there on their way to Auschwitz and other camps also. This is a photograph of the Drancy internment camp, basically abandoned apartment buildings. The Nazis surrounded it with barbed wire so no one could get in or out, of course. And inmates, prisoners were loaded into the apartments. I heard an interview yesterday where one of the inmates who basically survived Auschwitz said that there were no appliances, of course, no furniture, of course, no electricity, no windows, no glass in the windows, and The Nazis put down straw in each of the apartments and just loaded people in on their way to the trains, to the cattle trains. On the left is a photograph from the Memorial de la Shoah presentation, and this is just an anonymous photograph of some of the first people who arrived at the Drancy camp. On the right-hand side is a photograph of prisoners. This is where my grandfather would have been put in these unfinished apartments with no glass. I knew all along for many years that my grandfather had been transported from Drancy to Auschwitz, my mother had told me, but I didn't know many details. In fact, I did not have his yahrzeit date. I did not know when he was sent to Drancy. I didn't have a date, and so on. And last Holocaust Day, exactly a year from today, a year ago, I was in contact with Abe Kunstler. He's a friend of ours from a trip to India, he and his wife. They live in New York. And I mentioned on our WhatsApp group that my grandfather was a French Jew who had been rounded up from Paris, but I didn't have much information. And on the WhatsApp, he asked me if I had been to the memorial to the French Jews, Mémorial de la Déportation des Juifs de France. And if I had said no, where is that? And we looked on the map, and it's a 45-minute drive from our house in Rehovot. I think I had heard about it, but never paid attention, and we had never been there. So in WhatsApp, he said, well, what was your grandfather's name? And I said, Shmuel Kornstein. So about an hour later on WhatsApp, he sent me some information, and I was quite amazed of getting information, which you'll see in the next slide. Our friend Abe has this book at home. It's called Memorial to the Jews Deported from France, 1942 to 1944, by Serge Klarsfeld, who did the research, collected photographs and testimony, etc. And I told Abe, no, I've never seen the book before. Maybe you could find my grandfather. So indeed, he opened it up and he checked. And he asked me, could this be your grandfather, Samuel Kornstein? He would have been born on the 6th of May, 1883, from Belgrade. So I looked up Belgrade, and indeed it is a city in Poland, and did some more research. And I had tears in my eyes. And yes, this is my grandfather, Samuel Kornstein. I wonder what other information I could find out here. So we looked further, and online found the Memorial de la Shoah, which is the Holocaust Memorial in France information. And they came up with Samuel Kornstein's name. And yes, it is my grandfather, Mr. Kornstein Samuel. It's translated, born on May 6, 1883 in Belgrade, was deported from Drancy on convoy number 33 on September 16, 1942. So convoy 33, I did not know that he was on that convoy, and that led us to more information, which you'll see in the next slides. So our friend Abe looked up convoy number 33 and found that it left Drancy for Auschwitz on September 16th. On this page, we understood that the Jews were rounded up from Paris 2 days previously, September 14th, which means that my grandfather was at Drancy for 2 days. I did not know that. On his particular convoy, there were 586 males and 407 females from different countries, Baltic region and Bulgaria and Yugoslavian Jews and Dutch Jews and others. I believe he was the only American. It does not list it here, but he was listed as an American with American citizenship. So we also found that out on this page. And then on the next page, we found out that there were some last-minute departures, 34 names, if you can see on the top of the page, 284 on the right. And then at the bottom it says that the convoy number 33 left the station of Drancy on September 16th at 8:55 a.m., so it was a 9 o'clock train heading towards Auschwitz with over 1,000 Jews. And when they arrived, 147 women and 300 able-bodied men were selected for work. I'm just reading from the right-hand side. And the rest of the convoy was basically gassed as soon as they got out. And I wondered if my grandfather had maybe made it through the Holocaust and maybe he survived Auschwitz. I had not known that before last year, but I knew that he was 59 years old. He would not have been chosen on a workforce because anybody over the age of about 45 was not chosen for a workforce. And he was not considered an able-bodied man. So I know what happened to him basically the same day that he arrived at Auschwitz. And we also came up with this document, and my grandfather was prisoner number 93 at Drancy. The Nazis clearly made a very good list here. They have his birthday, which we already knew, his nationality, American, Belgrade, Poland, we knew, and then his address, we knew, 30 Rue de Vaucouleurs, I hope I'm pronouncing it correctly, and then couturier, which I thought, what is this? And I looked it up on Google Translate, and it means a fashion designer. He designed jewelry boxes, so they actually wrote that down also. So this was further confirmation that he was on this convoy. When I looked at the entire page that Abe sent me a copy of, he photographed it. Of course, I saw my grandfather's name in the lower left-hand corner, Samuel Kornstein, etc. And I looked on the exact same page and I saw a circle in blue. So on WhatsApp, I asked Abe, so why is that circled? And he told me that that is his grandmother, Rebecca Kunstler. So I was pretty emotional. Can you imagine? On Convoy 33 is my grandfather, who I only found out about this last year, and Abe's grandmother. Who knows, they might have been even sitting near each other. And who would have thought, certainly not they, that 78 years later, their two grandchildren who met in India would know and have records that Rebecca Kunstler, Zichrona Livracha, and my grandfather, Zichrona Livracha, would be remembered, and that we would know that they were sent on the same convoy. We would know they were headed for Auschwitz. They are certainly not forgotten, and I'm sure it would never have occurred to them that we would ever know where they went, where they were, and for me it's very touching. We are almost to the end of this presentation. This is my mother's headstone. She is buried in Rehovot, about a 10-minute walk from our house in Israel. It reads, our dear mother, grandmother, and sister, Lena Leah Newman, the daughter of Chaim Shmuel Kornstein. She passed away in 1995. My uncle Max came to visit about a year after she passed away. He wasn't able to come to the funeral. We, meanwhile, had put down Achoti, which is my sister, to make sure, because he was still alive. That was very meaningful for him. We also put down an extra little book in memory of Chaim Shmuel Kornstein, who perished in Auschwitz in 1942. At that time, when we put up the stone in 1995, we had no other details except that he perished in Auschwitz in 1942. So we've learned a lot more since. When Sherman, my husband, and I went to Poland on a trip about 10 years ago with a group, and we visited Auschwitz and Birkenau, I took 18 little stones from the Rehovot cemetery, and those were all of the offspring of Chaim Shmuel. So it was his 3 children, my mother, Morris and Max, and it's my mother's 2 children, myself and my brother Richard, and Max's 3 children, Steve and Fran and Danielle, and grandchildren who had been born. So I wrote a poem, and in Birkenau, I read the poem about how if I had been alive then, I probably would have been in the Partisanim and run away with him and escaped and survived. And I left the 18 stones in Birkenau at the gas chambers that had been bombed after the war by the Germans. And then several years ago, 3 years ago, when our granddaughter Leora, Lalu, went to Poland on a high school trip, she also took stones from the Rehovot cemetery, and she had visited my mother's grave and, of course, the memory of her grandfather. And she took a corresponding number of stones from the Rehovot cemetery, many more than 18, of more grandchildren who were born. And she also read her own poem there in Poland and also left the stones. So we hope he certainly is remembered with love. We were very honored that Uncle Max came to visit us in Rehovot. He lived with us for 3 months in 1996. He also helped us move to our beautiful house in Rehovot. He was with us during Shai's bar mitzvah. Shai is with the glasses in the middle. Uncle Max is with a blue shirt on the right. And we also went to the cemetery where he saw his sister's headstone and his father's headstone. And we were very honored that he spent time with us. And I hope that Chaim Shmuel Kornstein, Zichrono Livracha, our grandfather, rests in peace and knows perhaps that he has wonderful children and grandchildren who remember him. My grandfather had 5 grandchildren, none of whom he knew about. On the right is my first cousin Steve, and below is my first cousin Fran, and I don't have a picture of Daniel. On the left is Uncle Max and his wife Rhoda in 1947. And of course he had my older brother Rick and myself. This is a picture from a different album that I put together on my father's side, so every picture has my brother Richard in it. On the left, of course, on the top is with my mom when I was a baby, and on the right is with my dad. And then on the bottom are more recent pictures, also with Rosa. Chaim Shmuel Kornstein, may his memory be for a blessing. And so, dear family, I hope you've learned a little bit more about your great-grandfather and your great-great-grandfather, and I hope you keep him in your heart for many years to come, and perhaps even light a Ner Zikaron, a remembrance candle for him on Holocaust Day, and especially on his Yartzeit date, which is the 7th of Tishrei, Tafshin Gimel. Yehi Ziro Baruch.